There is a date on the Jewish calendar that has no explanation. Not one, not two, but three of the worst catastrophes in the entire history of the Jewish people all happened on the exact same day. Different centuries, different enemies, different weapons. Same date. The 9th day of the month of Av. In 586 BC, on the 9th of Av, the army of Babylon broke through the walls of Jerusalem and burned Solomon's temple to the ground. 656 years later, on the 9th of Av, the Romans did it again. They destroyed the second temple, the one Herod had rebuilt, leaving not one stone standing upon another. And then, more than 1,000 years after that, on the 9th of Av in 1492, the King and Queen of Spain signed the order expelling every Jewish man, woman, and child from Spanish soil. 3 annihilations. 1 date. Across 15 centuries. Coincidence does not stretch that far. But here is the question that nobody in the history books seems to want to answer directly. The question that keeps coming back, quiet and heavy, like smoke that won't leave a room. Where was God? Not where were the armies. Not what were the geopolitical miscalculations. Not which king made the wrong alliance. Those answers are easy. Historians love those answers. But where was the God who had personally chosen this city? The God who had filled the temple with his own glory, a pillar of cloud by day and fire by night, the God who had said, "This is where I will place my name forever." Why did he allow his own house to burn? That is not a comfortable question. It is not the kind of question that gets a clean answer in 30 seconds. But it is the only question worth asking. Because if you understand why the temple burned, you will understand something about how God works that most people spend their entire lives missing. And you might recognize the same pattern in your own lives. This is not just the story of a building that was destroyed. This is the story of a covenant that was broken, a warning that was ignored for 40 years, a nation that confused the presence of a temple with the presence of God in a devastating moment. They discovered those are not the same thing. Stay with us, because before the fire comes the silence. And the silence is where everything begins. If you have ever stood in the rubble of something you thought God would never allow to fall, a marriage, a faith, a life you built carefully, then this channel was made for you. We don't do easy answers here. We go into the fire and we look for what survives. Subscribe and walk with us. To understand why the temple burned, you have to go back further than the armies, further than the politics, further than the king who made the wrong decision at the wrong moment. You have to go back to a valley outside Jerusalem called Tophet. And what happened there is not something most people want to talk about in a Sunday homily. Tophet was a place in the valley of Hinnom, just south of the city walls. It had a name that meant fire pit in the old tongue. And the reason it had that name was because of what the people of Judah were doing there, not in secret, not in shame, but openly, repeatedly, generation after generation. They were burning their children alive as offerings to a god named Moloch. Not strangers, not enemies, their own sons and daughters. infants placed into the arms of the bronze idol heated from below until the metal glowed red. The drums would beat louder to drown out the screaming. Priests of the true God looked the other way, and the smoke rose from the valley right outside the walls of the city where Solomon's temple stood. This is the context the history books skip when they talk about why Babylon came. The God of Israel had made a covenant with this people unlike anything in the ancient world. Not a contract between equals, a covenant of grace, initiated entirely by God. He had pulled them out of Egypt when they were slaves. He had fed them in the desert when there was nothing to eat. He had given them a land, a law, an identity as a nation set apart. And the terms were not complicated. Walk with me. Keep the covenant. Do not run after the gods of the nations around you. That was it. That was the whole agreement. But the history of Israel is, in many ways, the history of a people who could not stay faithful to one God when the world around them offered so many others. Not because the other gods were better. Not because the other gods answered prayers or performed miracles. But because the other gods asked less of them. Moloch did not require justice for the poor. Baal did not demand that you release your slaves every 7th year. Asherah did not ask you to forgive debts or love your neighbor. The gods of the nations around Israel were convenient gods. Comfortable gods. Gods who asked for a sacrifice once in a while and then left you alone to do whatever you wanted with the rest of your life. The God of Sinai was not that kind of God. And so, slowly, over generations, the people of Judah began to double debt. They would come to the temple on the holy days, bring their offerings, sing the psalms, go through all the motions, and then walk back down the hill to Tophet and burn their children for Moloch. They thought they could hold both. They thought God would not notice. Or perhaps worse, they thought God would not act. They were about to find out how wrong they were. Into this world God sent a man named Jeremiah. Jeremiah did not ask for the job. The text is explicit about this.
I beg you.
When God called him, his first response was essentially, "I am too young. I don't know how to speak. Please send someone else." God did not send someone else. He touched Jeremiah's mouth and gave him words that would burn like fire, words the people of Jerusalem would spend 40 years trying to ignore. 40 years. That is how long Jeremiah preached before the walls fell. 40 years of standing in the temple courts, in the city gates, in the palace quarters, saying the same thing in 100 different ways. Turn back. The covenant is broken. If you do not return, what you think is indestructible will be destroyed. And the response he received was not debate. It was not even dismissal. It was violence. He was beaten and put in stocks at the city gate, publicly humiliated in front of the people he was trying to warn. He was thrown into a muddy cistern and left to sink, slowly, into the mire at the bottom, until a foreign official, not even a Jew, pulled him out with ropes. He was accused of treason for telling the truth. He was forbidden from entering the temple. He was arrested, tried, nearly executed.
I will not yield.
And still he kept speaking.
Words are truth.
There is something almost unbearable about Jeremiah's faithfulness. He was not a hero who enjoyed the fight. He wrote some of the most honest words ever recorded about the cost of obedience to God. He said, "The word of God has brought me nothing but insult and reproach all day long." I said, "I will not speak in his name anymore." But then it was like fire shut up in my bones, and I could not hold it in. A man who did not want the mission, who tried to quit, who was broken by it, who kept going anyway, not because it was working,
but my path
because
is
it was
clear.
true. Meanwhile, inside the temple, something invisible was happening. The prophet Ezekiel, in a vision, watched it unfold in slow motion. He saw the glory of God, that luminous, overwhelming presence that had filled the temple at its dedication. He saw it begin to move. First, from the Holy of Holies to the threshold of the temple. Then, from the threshold to the eastern gate of the temple court. Then, from the eastern gate to the Mount of Olives hovering at the edge of the city, as if reluctant to leave. And then it was gone. The temple was still standing. The priests were still performing their rituals. The sacrifices were still being offered. The incense still rose toward a heaven that was now, by the testimony of the prophet, empty. The building remained. The presence had departed. This is the theological truth at the heart of everything that followed. The people of Judah had confused the symbol with the reality. They believed that because the temple was standing, God was with them. That because they were performing the rituals, the covenant was intact. That the building itself was a kind of insurance policy that God would never allow his own house to be destroyed, regardless of what happened inside their hearts. Jeremiah warned them explicitly. He stood in the temple gate and said these words, "Do not trust in deceptive words and say, 'The temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord,'
is at hand."
3 times, as if he knew exactly how deep the delusion ran.
You are not welcome here.
They did not listen. And so by the time Nebuchadnezzar's army appeared on the horizon, the temple was already, in the most important sense, hollow. The fire that would consume it from the outside was only finishing what the people of Judah had already accomplished from the inside. God does not abandon suddenly. He withdraws slowly, quietly, graciously, giving every possible chance to turn back. But there comes a moment when the withdrawal is complete. When the prayers hit the ceiling of a house that heaven has already vacated. Jeremiah knew that moment had come. And he wept. Not because he had been right. There is no satisfaction in being right about a catastrophe. He wept because he had loved these people with everything he had, for 40 years. And they had chosen the fire pit over the living God. And now both fires were coming. Here is what I keep coming back to when I read this story. Jeremiah is the most relatable figure in the entire Bible to me, not because he was heroic, but because he was honest about how hard it is to keep going when nothing you do seems to matter. He is the patron saint of everyone who has ever tried to do the right thing in the right direction and watched it make no visible difference for years. But the text never says the mission failed. It says the people rejected it. Those are not the same thing. Jeremiah's words survived the fire. His book is still being read 3,000 years later. Sometimes faithfulness looks like failure for a very long time before it looks like anything else. Zedekiah was not supposed to be king. He was not the firstborn. He was not the chosen heir. He was not even the most capable man in the royal family. He was the third son of Josiah, placed on the throne of Jerusalem by a foreign emperor who needed a compliant administrator in a restless province, someone who would collect taxes, maintain order, and cause no problems. His real name was Mattaniah. Nebuchadnezzar changed it to Zedekiah when he installed him. That detail matters more than it might seem. In the ancient world, changing someone's name was an act of ownership. It was a declaration: you exist because I allow it. Your identity belongs to me now. Zedekiah accepted the new name. He accepted the throne. He accepted the tribute payments, the annual humiliation of sending gold and silver to Babylon to buy the privilege of remaining nominally king of a city that was, in every practical sense, already conquered. For 8 years, he played the role assigned to him. And then the whispering started.
Are you sure
The
about
voices came from inside the palace first.
this? We must act before
There
dawn.
was a faction among the court officials, men with power, men with money, men with nothing to lose and everything to gain from a change in the geopolitical order, who had been watching the Babylonian Empire with calculating eyes. Babylon was overextended, they argued. Nebuchadnezzar was fighting on too many fronts. Egypt, the ancient power to the south, was resurgent under a new pharaoh. The math was simple. If you were willing to be ruthless about it, stop paying tribute, form a military alliance with Egypt, and when Babylon inevitably collapsed under its own weight, Judah would be free. It was not an irrational argument. On paper, in a war room, with maps and troop estimates, it almost made sense. The problem was that it was built entirely on assumptions. The assumption that Babylon was weaker than it looked. The assumption that Egypt was stronger than it was. The assumption that a small nation wedged between two superpowers could successfully play them against each other and survive. And there was one voice in Jerusalem that had been saying, for 40 years, that these assumptions were wrong. Jeremiah did not oppose the rebellion because he was a coward or a collaborator. He opposed it because God had told him, explicitly, that resistance was futile, not because Babylon was invincible, but because what was coming was not primarily a military event. It was a covenant judgment. The exile was not a geopolitical accident. It was the consequence that had been written into the agreement at Sinai, the price that would be paid for a broken covenant. He told Zedekiah this directly, privately, in the palace. He said, "Submit to the king of Babylon. Serve him and his people and you will live. Why should this city become a ruin?" It was not what a king wanted to hear from a prophet. Kings want prophets who validate their decisions, who call down fire on their enemies, who tell the army that God is on their side. Zedekiah had those prophets. He had a whole court full of the men who said exactly what he wanted to hear, who promised victory and independence and the favor of heaven. He chose the comfortable prophecy over the true one. In the 9th year of his reign, Zedekiah stopped sending tribute to Babylon.
Get out! out. You are no
He
longer
expelled
welcome
the
here.
Babylonian diplomatic
This is an
representatives
outrage.
from
You will
Jerusalem.
regret this. Leave.
He sent messengers to Egypt requesting military assistance. In practice, he had just declared war on the most powerful military force on earth. Nebuchadnezzar's response was not what Zedekiah had hoped. There were no diplomatic channels opened, no renegotiation of terms, no warning shot fired across the bow. The full imperial army mobilized and marched southwest. When the watchmen on the towers of Jerusalem first saw the dust cloud rising on the northern horizon, they were not looking at a punitive expedition or a show of force. They were looking at an instrument of annihilation. Tens of thousands of soldiers, cavalry, siege engineers, and the most sophisticated military logistics apparatus the ancient world had ever produced, moving with the slow, inexorable certainty of a flood. Zedekiah's Egyptian alliance, the cornerstone of his entire strategy, materialized briefly and then evaporated. Egyptian forces made a tentative advance toward Jerusalem. Babylon turned to face them, and Egypt retreated. Just as Jeremiah had said they would.
They are coming.
The
Do not let
prophet
it fall
sent a
into their
message
hands.
to the king
Go.
even as the
Now.
siege was being established.
I have to
Do
keep
not
running.
deceive
They're
yourselves,
still there.
thinking the
Just a little
Babylonians will surely leave
Stop now. It's
us.
useless.
They will not leave. The king of Judah was now alone, inside a city that was about to become a prison. The siege began in the 10th month of the 9th year of Zedekiah's reign. The Babylonian engineers did not attempt to storm the walls. Jerusalem sat on a ridge surrounded by steep valleys, a natural fortress that would cost an attacker thousands of lives to assault directly. Nebuchadnezzar had not built an empire by wasting men on walls he could simply weigh down. Instead, his engineers constructed a circumvallation wall, a continuous barrier encircling the entire city, built by the besiegers themselves, designed to ensure that nothing moved in or out. No food, no water, no messengers, no hope of relief. And then the Babylonian army did something that required extraordinary discipline and patience.
Remember that goat story?
They sat down. They built their camps. They cooked their meals. They trained their soldiers. They maintained their siege positions through summer heat and winter rain. And they waited. 30 months. 2 years and 6 months of watching a city slowly consume itself from the inside while the army outside remained fed, rested, and ready. Inside Jerusalem, the mathematics of survival became brutal within weeks. The city had granaries, but they had not been built for an indefinite siege. Grain reserves that seemed substantial in the first month looked different in the 6th month, and terrifying by the 12th. The water cisterns, carved deep into the limestone bedrock, held enough for a time, but a city under siege in the summer heat of Judah consumes water faster than any peacetime calculation predicts. Prices moved in one direction only. A measure of wheat that had cost a few silver coins before the siege was selling for what had been a month's wages by the end of the first year. Families who had been prosperous merchants, landowners, officials of the court found that their wealth had become abstract. You cannot eat a deed to a house. You cannot drink a chest of silver. The hierarchy that had structured Jerusalem's society for generations dissolved, and in its place there was only one distinction that mattered: those who still had food, and those who did not. The Book of Lamentations, written in the immediate aftermath of the siege, records what happened next in language that is almost impossible to read without flinching. The prophet describes noblemen, men who had worn purple robes and dined on delicacies, wandering through the streets with skin blackened and shriveled, their bodies reduced to something barely recognizable as human. Children crying for bread in the public squares while their parents had nothing, literally nothing to give them. And then the text described something that is no comfortable theological framing and no easy explanation. Women who had been known for their compassion, their gentleness, their instinct toward nurture, driven past the breaking point of what a human mind can endure, cooked and ate their own children. This is not metaphor. The text is specific. The historical record is consistent. This happened. The siege of Jerusalem was not defeated by Babylonian spears. It was imploded by starvation. By the time the walls finally broke, the city had already broken from within. There is something Jeremiah wrote in the middle of Lamentations that I find almost impossible to get past. In the 3rd chapter, after cataloging devastation that would justify despair in anyone, he stops. And he writes this, "Yet this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. Because of the Lord's great love we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning." He wrote that in the ruins, surrounded by evidence that everything had gone catastrophically wrong, with the smoke of the burned temples still hanging over the city. After watching everything he had spent his life trying to prevent come to pass exactly as he had warned it would. And he chose hope, not optimism. He was not pretending things were fine, but hope. The stubborn, costly, irrational decision to believe that mercy was still available on the other side of judgment. That is not a comfortable theological position. It is not a position you arrive at easily. It is a position you fight your way to through grief and confusion and the long silence of unanswered prayers. Jeremiah found it in the ruins of Jerusalem, and he wrote it down so that every person who came after him, every person who has ever sat in the rubble of something they thought God would protect, would know that someone had been there before them and had found mercy waiting. If this story is reaching something inside you, if you recognize this city, this silence, this feeling of watching something collapse that you thought was permanent, then stay with us through the end. What comes next is not just destruction. It is the moment the fire reveals what cannot be burned. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that mercy outlasts ruins. On the 9th day of the 4th month, in the 11th year of Zedekiah's reign, the wall broke. Not with a dramatic explosion, not with the sound of 10,000 war cries. After 30 months of engineering work, of studying the limestone foundations, of probing for fractures, of applying sustained pressure at exactly the right points, a section of the northern wall simply gave way. Stone that had stood for generations cracked, shifted, and opened. And through that gap poured the bronze and iron of Babylon. The defenders who had survived 30 months of siege were not the men who had climbed those walls at the beginning. They were shadows.
I can't hold it.
Men who had burned through every reserve of physical strength and had been running on something thinner than that for weeks. When the breach opened, there was no heroic last stand, no final charge,
Quickly!
No moment of cinematic defiance. They fell back, and the city fell with them. Zedekiah was
No.
watching from somewhere
What is this?
inside the palace
Leave me
when the
alone.
news
No.
reached
No,
him.
not me! Get back!
And in
Get
that
back.
moment, the king of Judah made the last decision of his reign. He ran, not toward the breach to rally his men, not toward the temple to pray, not toward his people to lead them through whatever came next. Under the cover of darkness, with a small contingent of his elite guard,
Keep pushing.
Zedekiah
We have to
slipped
keep
through
moving.
a narrow passage near the king's
I can't
guard and a
breathe.
hidden route between
Just
the
a
two
little
defensive
further.
walls
Move.
and fled southeast into the night, toward the plains of Jericho, toward the Jordan River, toward the desert beyond. He left behind every person who had trusted him with their lives. The Babylonian intelligence network was faster than his legs. Scouts tracked the group across the open plains of Jericho flat, exposed ground with nowhere to hide, no cover, no shadow large enough to swallow a king. When the Babylonian cavalry closed in, the elite guard that had sworn their lives to Zedekiah's protection did what men do when the mathematics of survival become personal. They scattered every direction into the darkness, and Zedekiah stood alone in the dust of the Judean plain, surrounded, with nowhere left to run and nothing left to be king of. He was taken north, not back to the ruined city he had abandoned, but to Riblah, in the territory of Hamath, the location of Nebuchadnezzar's field headquarters. The journey itself must have been a particular kind of agony. Miles of road traveled in chains, through a landscape that had once been his kingdom, past towns and villages that bore the marks of what his decisions had cost. When he arrived at Riblah, he was not brought before a judge. He was brought before a creditor. Nebuchadnezzar had installed Zedekiah on the throne, had given him a kingdom to administer, had asked for nothing beyond tribute and loyalty. And Zedekiah had taken all of that and used it to raise a rebellion. In the calculus of ancient imperial justice, this was not merely a military defeat to be processed. It was a personal betrayal to be answered. The emperor did not rush the punishment. He designed it.
Let us go.
Nebuchadnezzar ordered that the sons of Zedekiah be brought into the courtroom.
My sons.
The prince's young men, some of them barely past boyhood, the future of the Davidic line, the continuation of everything the dynasty of Judah had been built to perpetuate. They were brought in one by one, in front of their father, who stood in bronze chains and could not move and could not look away. And they were executed, one by one, in front of his eyes. The cruelty of this was not accidental. It was architectural. Nebuchadnezzar was not simply killing princes. He was making Zedekiah watch the extinction of his own future, the erasure of his dynasty, the death of everything his reign was supposed to protect and perpetuate. He was ensuring that the last images Zedekiah's mind would ever receive were images of irreversible loss. Because what came next was the part that made the execution of the princes something worse than grief. When the last of his sons had fallen, the soldiers turned to Zedekiah, and they put out his eyes. Not killed, not imprisoned in darkness, blinded deliberately, surgically, with intention so that the final thing his eyes would ever record The image that would live in permanent replay in the darkness behind his ruined sight for whatever years remained to him was the death of his children. He was then bound in bronze shackles and led on the long road to Babylon, where he would die in a foreign prison, in a foreign city, under a foreign sky, carrying that one image in the darkness behind his eyes until the day he ceased to carry anything at all. 30 days passed between the fall of the city and the arrival of Nebuchadnezzar. 30 days in which Jerusalem existed in a kind of suspended ruin, conquered but not yet erased, broken but not yet burned. The temple still stood on its hill. Soldiers
Keep
walked
moving.
through its courts.
This place
The great
smells of
bronze
incense.
pillars,
Watch your step.
Jachin and
Nothing
Boaz,
here worth taking.
still framed the entrance to a sanctuary that had lost its king, its priests, and its God. The weight was not mercy. It was logistics. Nebuchadnezzar, chief of the imperial guard, arrived with a specific mandate: not to occupy the city, not to establish a garrison and move on. He had come to execute an instruction that Nebuchadnezzar had given with the precision of an engineer. Jerusalem was not to be merely defeated. It was to be unmade as a center of power, rendered incapable of ever again becoming the nucleus of rebellion against the empire. He began with the symbols. The palace of the king gone. The houses of the officials who had counseled the rebellion gone. The administrative buildings that had housed the machinery of Judean governance gone. Nebuchadnezzar moved through the city with the methodical efficiency of a man who understood that symbols are not decorations. They are load-bearing structures of identity. Destroy the symbols and you destroy the story of people tell themselves about who they are. And then he turned to the temple. The cedar of Lebanon that formed the interior structure of the sanctuary had been aging for 4 centuries. Cut in the mountains of the north, shipped down the coast, hauled up the hills of Jerusalem by the labor of thousands, ancient wood, dried by centuries of Judean climate, sealed with oils and resins and the slow accumulation of incense smoke. When the torches were applied, it did not simply catch fire, it detonated. The intensity of the combustion was beyond what stone and bronze were designed to survive. The limestone blocks, the same pale Jerusalem limestone that still defines the city's silhouette today, did not merely blacken. They fractured thermally, expanding and cracking under temperatures that turned the sanctuary into a kiln. The gold overlay that had covered the walls of the Holy of Holies, the gold that Solomon had applied in sheets across every surface of the inner sanctuary, liquefied. It ran in rivulets through the cracks in the fracturing stone floor, mixing with ash and debris, fusing permanently into the destruction layer that archaeologists would find 26 centuries later. The fire did not end in an evening. The Book of Kings says the fire began on the 7th day of the month. Jeremiah records the 10th. The rabbinic tradition settled on the 9th Tisha B'Av as the permanent day of mourning. The most honest explanation for this discrepancy is also the most terrible. The fire burned for days. It started on one afternoon, raged through the night, continued consuming through the following day, and kept burning until there was nothing left to burn. For days, the people who had survived the siege watched the smoke column rising from the mount where their God had said he would place his name forever. They watched it and they understood, in a way that required no theological explanation, that an era had ended. The world they had known, the world organized around the temple, around the sacrifices, around the visible, physical presence of the covenant at the center of the city, that world was gone. Not damaged, not temporarily disrupted, gone. What came next, none of them could have predicted. Nebuzaradan soldiers moved through the ruins with the efficiency of a demolition crew that had also been given a shopping list. The temple had functioned as the central treasury of the nation. What the fire had not consumed, the empire intended to collect. The bronze pillars Jachin and Boaz were too large to transport intact. The engineers solved this problem without sentiment. They broke them. Works of art that had taken master craftsmen years to produce. Objects that had stood at the entrance of the house of God for nearly 4 centuries were reduced to manageable scrap metal, broken with hammers, loaded onto carts, assigned a value in bronze by weight. The great bronze sea, the enormous circular basin that had held water for the ritual purifications of the priests, was broken apart and carted away. The gold lampstands, the incense altars, the bowls and basins and tongs and snuffers of the inner sanctuary, every object that had been used in the worship of God was inventoried, packed, and dispatched eastward to be used in the banquets of Babylon, where they would hold wine drunk in honor of gods who had no covenant with anyone. And then Nebuzaradan turned to the people. The Babylonian policy of population management was calculated and cold. They did not want a province full of desperate, landless people with no stake in the empire's stability and every reason to rebel. They separated the survivors with bureaucratic precision. The skilled craftsmen, the metalworkers, the builders, the intellectuals, the young men of military age were chained into long columns and marched east. Their skills would build Babylon's glory. Their displacement would ensure Judah's impotence. The old, the sick, the agricultural poor who had never held political power and never would, they were left behind in the ruins. Inheritors of a devastated land, without the social infrastructure to organize resistance, without the resources to rebuild, without the leaders who might have given them direction. Jerusalem was now, in every meaningful sense, empty. There is a moment in this story that I keep returning to, and it has nothing to do with kings or armies. It is the moment Nebuzaradan's soldiers broke the pillars of Jachin and Boaz with hammers. Those pillars had names. In the ancient world, you did not name a structural element unless it meant something. Jachin means he will establish. Boaz means in him is strength. Every priest who had walked between those pillars for 4 centuries had passed under a declaration: God establishes. God is the strength. And now they were scrap bronze on a cart, heading to Babylon. I wonder sometimes about the person who watched that happen, who knew what the names meant, who had grown up walking between those pillars. What it cost them to watch the declaration of God's faithfulness get broken into pieces and weighed by an enemy soldier. And I wonder whether they had any way of knowing, in that moment, that the faith those pillars had pointed to, not the metal, not the building, but the living reality behind it, was about to survive everything the empire had thrown at it, and outlast Babylon itself by 3,000 years. Sometimes you cannot see what is being preserved when everything visible is being destroyed. The exiles walked east. There is no other way to say it that captures what it was. Not a migration. Not a relocation. A forced march of chained human beings across hundreds of miles of desert and valley, under the supervision of soldiers who had no interest in their comfort and every interest in their arrival. Men and women who had grown up in the hill country of Judah, who had oriented their entire lives around a city on a ridge, a temple on a hill, a God who had promised to dwell among them, now walking away from all of it, with the smoke of Jerusalem still visible behind them for the first days of the journey. They carried nothing except what they were. And what they were, in that moment, was a people whose entire theological framework had just been demolished along with their city. In the ancient world, the destruction of a temple was not a real estate loss. It was a cosmological statement. Every nation in the ancient Near East understood the temple of a god as the place where that god lived, literally, physically, the residence of the divine. When an army destroyed your temple, the message was unambiguous. Your God has been defeated. Your God is either dead, or weaker than our gods, or has abandoned you entirely. The religion dies with the building. The people who survive assimilate into the conquering culture, and their God becomes a footnote, a memory, eventually nothing at all. This is what happened to every other people in the ancient world whose temple was destroyed. Every other people except one. The Babylonian captivity lasted 70 years. 70 years is not a pause. It is not an interruption. It is long enough for everyone who remembered Jerusalem to grow old and die, and for an entire generation to be born, live their full lives, and die in a foreign land without ever having seen the city their parents wept about. It is long enough for a culture to dissolve entirely into the dominant civilization surrounding it. And yet, in the absence of a temple, in the absence of an altar, in the absence of the entire sacrificial system that had structured Jewish worship for centuries, something remarkable happened. The exiles did not assimilate. They did not abandon their God. They did not conclude, as every cultural logic available to them suggested they should, that the destruction of the temple meant the defeat of the God who had dwelt in it. Instead, they asked a different question. Not where is God now that the temple is gone? But who told us God could only be found in the temple? They went back to the texts, to the scrolls of the Torah that some of them had carried out of Jerusalem, the words of Moses, the Psalms, the writings of the prophets. And in those texts they found something that the temple ritual, for all its beauty and power, had perhaps obscured. A God who had been present with Abraham in Mesopotamia before there was ever a temple. A God who had spoken to Moses in the desert, in a burning bush, with no altar in sight. A God who had told Jeremiah explicitly, in words that were now being read in Babylon, I will be a sanctuary for them in the countries where they have gone. The God of Israel had never been confined to the building. The building had been a gift, a meeting point, a visible sign of an invisible reality. But the reality had never depended on the sign. This was the revelation that the exile forced upon them. In Babylon, without a temple, the synagogue was born.
Please remember
Not a
your
replacement for the temple.
Remember
The
your
exiles
people,
never
Lord.
stopped praying for the
How
temple's
long must we
restoration,
suffer this ruin?
but a new form of communal life organized around something the Babylonians could not burn: text, prayer, memory, and the gathered community of the faithful. They began to meet in houses, to read the Torah aloud together, to pray the prayers that had once accompanied the temple sacrifices, prayers that could be offered anywhere, by anyone, without an altar, without a priest, without an animal. They began to study the law with an intensity that the comfortable rhythms of temple-centered life had perhaps never demanded. When you have the building, it is easy to let the building do the spiritual work for you. When the building is gone, you discover whether your faith was ever really yours. For many of them, it was. And it deepened in the fire. The rabbis who emerged from this period laid the foundations of a tradition that would survive the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD, the expulsion from Spain in 1492, the Inquisition, the pogroms of Eastern Europe, and the Holocaust of the 20th century. A tradition portable enough to survive in any land, in any century, under any regime, because it had been stripped of its dependence on any single location. Nebuchadnezzar had tried to destroy a people by destroying their center. What he actually did was force them to discover that their center was not a place. And then there is Tisha B'Av. The 9th of Av became, in Jewish tradition, the permanent annual day of mourning for the temple. Not just for the first temple, for every catastrophe the Jewish people have suffered across the centuries. The destruction of the Second Temple by Rome in 70 AD happened, according to the historical record, on the 9th of Av. The expulsion from England in 1290, the 9th of Av. The expulsion from Spain in 1492, the 9th of Av. The outbreak of the First World War, which set in motion the chain of events that would lead to the Holocaust. Historians have noted that the German ultimatum to Russia that triggered the cascade of declarations was issued on the 9th of Av, 1914. The accumulation is too consistent to be comfortable. Whether you read it as providence, as the meaningful patterning of history by a God who operates outside of time, or simply as the kind of coincidence that becomes visible only in retrospect, the date carries a weight that no other date in human history quite matches. It is the date on which a people learned, repeatedly, across 3,000 years, that everything visible can be taken away, and that something remains. 50 years after the destruction of the First Temple, Cyrus the Great of Persia conquered Babylon. In the first year of his reign, he issued a decree recorded in the Book of Ezra and confirmed by the Cyrus Cylinder, an archaeological artifact that sits in the British Museum today, authorizing the Jewish exiles to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. Babylon, the empire that had seemed permanent, that had burned the house of God and carried its worshippers into captivity, lasted less than a century after the destruction of Jerusalem. The people it had tried to erase went home and built again. This is the pattern. Not that God prevents catastrophe. Not that faithfulness protects you from loss. But that what God preserves through catastrophe is something the catastrophe cannot touch: identity, covenant, calling, the indestructible core of a people who know who they are and whose they are. The temple of cedar and gold burned. The temple of prayer and text and community and memory, the portable temple. The temple that traveled to Babylon in the hearts of the exiles. The temple did not burn. It could not. It was made of something that fire does not consume. I have been sitting with this story for a long time. And the thing that stays with me is not the destruction, it is the 70 years of ordinary faithfulness in an ordinary foreign city, by people who had every reason to give up and did not. Nobody writes epic poetry about those 70 years. There are no famous battles, no miraculous deliverances, no burning bushes or parted seas. There is just a community of displaced people, meeting in houses, reading texts, raising children in a faith that had no building to point to, no altar to sacrifice at, no visible sign that God was still present. And out of those 70 quiet, unglamorous, faithfully lived years came the rabbinic tradition that shaped the entire subsequent history of Western civilization through Judaism, through Christianity, through Islam. 3 of the world's major religions carry the DNA of what was born in Babylonian exile. Nebuchadnezzar thought he was ending a story. He was, without knowing it, beginning one. The ruins of his empire are a tourist attraction. The people he exiled are still here. If you have lost something you thought was permanent, if you have sat in the ruins of something you built carefully and loved deeply and believed God would protect, then you already understand what the exiles understood on the road to Babylon. The question is not whether the temple falls. The question is what you carry with you when it does. Share this video with someone who is walking through their own Babylon right now. They need to know that the fire does not have the last word. 3,000 years ago, a fire burned on a hill in Jerusalem. It burned for days. It consumed cedar that had stood for 4 centuries. Gold that had been hammered into place by craftsmen who believed they were building something eternal. Stone that cracked and fractured under heat. It was never designed to survive. It consumed the most beautiful building in the ancient world, the physical center of a nation's identity, the place where a people had gone to meet their God for nearly 400 years. And when the smoke finally cleared, the hill was empty. But the people were still there. Broken, chained, walking east into an exile that would last 70 years. Carrying nothing except the words, the texts, the prayers, the promises, the memory of a God who had spoken to their ancestors in deserts and burning bushes and still, small voices in the night. Words that no army could confiscate. Words that no fire could reach. Nebuchadnezzar built an empire and called it permanent. It lasted less than a century after the fire on the hill. The people he tried to erase are still here. This is what the story of Solomon's temple teaches, if you are willing to sit with it long enough. God does not always protect what we build in His name. Sometimes He allows the fire not as abandonment, but as refinement. Not as the end of the story, but as the moment that separates what is eternal from what was always temporary. The temple of cedar and gold was always going to end. Every physical thing ends. What God was preserving through its destruction was something that destruction could not touch. A covenant written not in stone, but in the hearts of a people who learned to carry their God with them wherever they went. If you are walking through your own Tisha B'Av right now, if something you built carefully, something you believe God would protect, has come down in fire around you, then the testimony of 3,000 years of history is this: the fire is not the final word. What survives the fire is the only thing that was ever truly yours. The temple that cannot burn is the one built inside you. If this journey has meant something to you, if you found something in these ashes worth carrying, then subscribe and walk with this community. Every week we go deeper into the stories that shaped faith, history, and the human soul. Not easy answers,
The truth.
not
The
comfortable
uncomfortable
religion,
truth
just
will
the fire
outlast the fire.
and what survives it. The 9th of Av comes every year on the Jewish calendar. And every year, the faithful sit on the floor, remove their shoes, and read the Book of Lamentations aloud in the dark. Not because they are stuck in grief, but because they remember. Because memory is how a people carries what cannot be carried any other way. Because somewhere in the honest acknowledgement of what was lost, there is always the quiet voice of what remains. Yet this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope.